Hi! So how nice would it be if when you're mixing, you know that you're always listening at the same optimal listening level to your mixes, so that you can discern every detail from low end to high end, and that you know instinctively that something is too loud or not loud enough. Even when you're just listening to the kick, the bass, you just know approximately how loud it should be because you're basically always listening at the same level. And furthermore, would it also not be nice if that listening level is the same in all studios that you go to, so that you can have the same experience over there? Well, this is what calibrating your monitors to a reference level can do for you. So let's go! Now, when I'm talking about calibrating your monitoring level, I'm not talking about frequency-related calibration, like you can, for example, do with Sound ID reference, but I'm talking volume, listening level. So the idea is that you determine a listening level in your studio, and that you always use that same listening level when you're mixing, mastering, or doing whatever. Now, when I say always, of course, you can still listen to your mixes really quiet as well, or really loud. There just are certain things which you only hear at those listening levels. But I can say that my monitoring controller back there is 95% of the time always at the same level. And I even have a preset on there that I can quickly return to that level. Now, why would you want to do that? What are the benefits? First of all, when you get used to that level, it allows you to more instinctively set levels in your mix. Because when you're always listening to things at the same level, you already know, well, this is a bit too loud, this is not loud enough, the mix in total should be louder or less loud, etc. So it allows you to mix more with your ears instead of having to rely on any visual feedback, for example. And the second thing is, when you know what your monitoring level is and how to get it, then if you change your monitors or you change any other gear which affects the volume that you're listening at, you always have a way to go back to exactly the same volume, even though you've changed equipment in your studio. It is basically a reproducible listening level. And thirdly, if you're calibrating to an industry standard reference level, then you can basically also get that level when you go to another studio. Of course, if they have calibrated their monitoring to the same industry standard. However, big studios usually do that. It may be less applicable to home studios because those studios are typically a bit smaller, and that means you cannot really calibrate to the industry standard levels, but more about that later. And the fourth benefit is that there is the so-called Fletcher-Munson curve, which basically says that your ears are more sensitive to certain frequencies depending on the loudness of what you're listening to. But there is a certain level at which this curve is the most flat, so that also helps you to get a more flat listening experience in which you can hear all frequencies equally well. Now, before I go into the actual calibration procedure, which I do not want to interrupt, if you like this video or think you're going to like it, please give it a big thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm. It also helps if you subscribe to the channel if you like this type of content, and ring the little bell icon so you get notified when I publish another video. For even more support, consider using the super thanks button below the video or using any of the affiliate links in the description before you buy anything at these stores. I will then get a small commission without any additional cost to you. But let's check out how to calibrate your monitors to a reference level. Now, step 1 in this procedure is to determine your digital operating level. And that typically means at what loudness level do you typically send out audio from Cubase or another DAW when you do your typical mixing work. Now, to determine that, you can, for example, have a look at some mixes that you did and see how loud the loudest sections register on the Cubase meter. Let's have a look. Now, this is, for example, a mix that I did for a recent video. I won't bother you with the audio, but when I play it, you can open the right zone in Cubase over here, and then you can go to the meter and you can select the loudness meter over here. It should be set to LUFS, and over here with this button you can reset the loudness measurement, and you can see that this mix registers at a loudness level of -17.2. Now, I have other mixes which registered around -23, so there's quite a bit of variation, but a typical digital operating level will probably be somewhere between -20 and -14 dBFS. Maybe -14 if you're used to really making your mix quite loud already and you have material with not a large dynamic range. And maybe -20 when you want to have some more headroom on top of your mix. So I will choose a level of -20 dBFS, which would be good for any material. And 20 dB is also about the headroom that they usually use for analog systems, so let's just go for that. Now remember, this level does not determine at all how loud you will be listening to your mix later on, because independent of the level that you choose here in step 1, we also have to determine how loud you're going to listen to your mixes later on, which is called the reference SPL level, and that's in decibels dB. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was the Fletcher-Munson curve. And from that curve, you can learn that an SPL reference level of 85 decibels is actually optimal as far as frequency distribution goes. Which means that if you listen at that level, your ear's sensitivity to the various frequencies is most flat. So in that respect, it would be the ideal SPL reference level. And a lot of big studios were actually calibrated to this. However, they used to use a Dolby test tone for this, which had a bit of a measuring issue, which resulted in most of those studios being calibrated to a reference level of 83 decibels, which is really the standard for big studios at the moment. However, 83 decibels for a home studio is really loud, and especially if your home studio is a bit smaller, not ideally acoustically treated, you'll get a lot of reflections which will basically drive you bonkers. So I would definitely choose a lower level. And there is actually a very nice Sound on Sound article from years ago, which has a little table that indicates, depending on your room size, which reference level you should choose. And my studio over here is pretty small. In the metric system, it's about 36 cubic meters, in which case this table advises an SPL reference level of 74 dB. Now, this is not exact science, of course. If you like to mix really loud, then you choose a slightly higher reference level. And if you like to mix a bit quieter, then you can equally choose a lower reference level. Whatever you feel comfortable with. The more important thing is that you remember the reference level that you choose, and always use this as your reference level for how loud you're listening to your mixes. So we have two numbers now, right? The digital operating level, which I'm choosing as minus 20 dBFS, and the SPL reference level, which I'm choosing as 74 dB. And that's 74 dB coming out of one speaker, by the way. So when you turn on your second speaker, it will definitely be louder than 74 dB. Now, next up, we need a test signal at the digital operating level. Let's see how we can get that in Cubase. So over here, I have my mixing level calibration project, which is very simple. There's not even audio in it. There are just two plugins on the inserts here. And one of those plugins is the Cubase test generator. And it is set to produce a noise test signal. And it should be pink noise, because it has a frequency distribution which slopes down a bit, which is more typical of sounds that we listen to all around us and in music. And the signal level over here, you should set to RMS instead of peak, which we're going to vary here in a minute to get to our digital operating level. But before we do that, I also have a second plugin on here, which is frequency, the Cubase equalizer. And there's only a certain band of that pink noise that we allow to pass through. Now, you can use pink noise without the additional frequency band, but especially in home studios, which are typically not very well acoustically treated, you may get issues with standing waves in the low frequencies or reflective surfaces on desks or walls, for example, which may skew the test results. So that's why we're cutting off all the high frequencies and all the low frequencies to get a more accurate measurement later on. But now we still have to set our digital operating level over here. So if we look at these frequency bands here, I have a low cutoff at 500 Hz with quite a steep slope. And I have a high cutoff at 2 kHz with the same steep slope. So this is what that sounds like. I'll cut out that sound in the edit so you don't have to listen to it all the time. But if I turn on the test generator again now, and again go to our loudness meter over here, you can see that it is now measuring minus 30 integrated loudness over here. And we want to get that up to our digital operating level of minus 20. So let's increase this. We can reset it over here so that the loudness measurement starts again. Okay, now it's a bit too much. Let's go back to 9. Measure again, almost right. Let's do minus 925, reset the measurements, and yeah, well, that's close enough. Minus 20 dB FS. And by the way, I will provide this Cubase project with a link down below, so you can immediately use it if you also want to calibrate your monitoring level. So we now have a project that consistently plays back at the digital operating level that we also want our mixes to be played back at. And the next step is to make sure that this plays back in our listening position in the studio over here on one speaker at the SPL reference level that we chose. Now, for this next step, you need an SPL meter, like for example this one over here, which is by Sphinx. They're not very expensive. If you don't have an SPL meter, you can also use an app on your phone, but the level that they measure is sometimes not quite accurate. For example, I had an SPL meter on my phone, which deviated about 6 dB from this meter over here. But I recently also found an app which was quite in line with this meter over here, and I'll put a link to that in the description. So what we're going to do now is we're going to play back this project on one speaker, and you can do that, for example, by muting a speaker at your monitor controller, or you can turn off one of the speakers. Or what you can also do is you can change the output in your Cubase project of this track. Now it's going to stereo out, but you can also set it to just go to the left speaker, for example. So let's do that in this case. And I will also show you my SPL meter. The screen of my iPhone is now cast to this app on my desktop, so that's why you can see it. And what's important is that you choose C-weighted measurement, which is that filter here on the left. You should set it to C. And you should also choose slow response. And even though that exact control is not on this app, it is usually on SPL meters. I noticed that the speed over here determines the response. So I set it to the lowest speed that's available over here one time. So the idea is now that we play back that reference signal on one speaker. I'm choosing the left one over here. And then we set our monitor controller so that this SPL meter reads 74 dB, which is our chosen SPL reference level. Now, if you don't have a monitor controller, you could also use the volume controller on your audio interface, for example. Or maybe you have a separate software application with your audio interface that you can use to set your volume. There are various ways depending on what kind of equipment you have, but I'm using my monitoring controller, so let's do that. So I'm going to start at a low level on my monitor controller and then gradually turn it up to get to the 74 dB. Just make sure to wait a bit every time because the speed is set to slow response. Let's try to get to 74 dB. Yeah, so that's about right. And on my monitor controller, I saw that I had to set it to 24 dB of attenuation. So that's a level that I will store as my reference level for the big volume button over there. And 95% of the time, I will have that volume button set to that level. Now, if you don't have a digital readout, you can also do a little marking on your volume control or stick a little piece of tape on it at that location so that you can always return to the same volume when you listen to your mixes. Now, if this level is very different to the volume that you usually listen to your mixes at, then you may need some time to get used to it. But over time, you will slowly learn how loud mixes will sound in your studio and how loud a kick will sound, how loud a bass guitar will sound, etc. So that you instinctively go for those levels when you're mixing without having to look at any metering. And when you get other monitors or equipment that changes your gain staging, then you now have a way to get right back to the correct level again that you're used to working at. Now remember, when you import a master track in Cubase or you're doing mastering yourself, that will not play back at -20 dBFS. It might be more in the range of -8, -7 or something like that if the master has been really slammed. So it will sound really loud unless you turn down your volume in that case. And I actually use the Cubase control room for that, so I can leave my monitoring controller at the same level. Because over here, if you go to the control room, there's a volume control over here. Turn off that test generator here for a second. And when I'm listening and doing production stuff, I just have it set to 0, which means that I hear everything at my mixing reference level, which I've set. But when I import a master into Cubase or when I'm trying to master in Cubase myself, I set this back to -12. So that I'm still getting approximately the same volume when listening to my monitors, even though the actual track that's playing is much louder than my mixes. And there's even a way to quickly switch between this, because there's a use reference level button over here. And if you click Alt and click it, now it has stored -12 as the reference level. So I can now set it back to 0 for normal use. And if I want to play a master, I quickly push this button and it resets to -12. And if I click it again, it will go back to my 0 for my usual mixing and production work. Now this procedure, I had to redo it again recently because I got new monitors, which I already made a video about, which I'll link over here. So check it out, enjoy, and see you soon.